Before the break, I said that we would look and see what lied hidden behind the publicity. This is the article that I've been building up to, and I keep saying this article that was released in 2015. And here is the science that lays behind a lot of the publicity that we experienced as a result of the measles outbreak in 2014 and all of what we heard in 2015 from the media. The title looks very impressive, doesn't it? Because the study was partially funded by Bill Gates Foundation and, believe it or not, the Department of United States Homeland Security. There were advanced Microsoft graphics that, while they were very pretty, were very intimidating. The explanatory language is totally inaccessible to most people, which was probably the intent from the start. As a former medical teaching professor, I know that it's actually the mark of a good teacher when the audience or student understands the message. Most doctors I've spoken to who saw the article can't get their heads around the analysis. It's not because they're dumb. The lead author is a medical student who appears to know very little about measles in the real-world context, but by his own admission, he loves fiddling with stats using mathematical modeling. I've put this study in front of epidemiologists and people who have majored in statistics, and the results don't make real-life sense to them either. So now we have a medical student partnering with a computer geek to produce statistical models so complex your eyes would glaze over. The important thing to the authors was to give parents a simple explanation. So this is what the public was told. They were told that measles disease is the cause of non-measles infectious disease death for 3 years after the measles infection, and that the measles vaccines prevent this problem. And the theory is that measles disease suppresses the immune system, causing immune amnesia for a long time after the infection. You get that? The problem with this hypothesis is that long-term immune suppression after measles disease was never a real phenomenon. The world's leading authority on non-specific effects of vaccines. Now let me tell you what that means. A vaccine, you inject it, and the specific effect for, say, measles vaccine is that it will prevent you from getting measles. A non-specific effect could be that you die, or that you have a bad, sore arm, or that you develop allergies, or in this case, that you live a long, healthy life longer than everybody else. So the world's leading authority tells us where this idea actually came from. It was a belief, not a fact. And that belief in long-term immune suppression came from a vaccine crisis that I actually never heard about. It occurred after a very high-dose measles vaccine was given to 4-month-old infants in Africa. That vaccine was associated with a twice higher death rate in those babies in the years following. So people thought, okay, the vaccine suppressed the immune system for a long time, and that must be the cause of the higher death. And then they thought maybe the disease does the same thing. But it turned out that the high-dose measles vaccine was not totally responsible for those long-term deaths. It was the DPT vaccines that were given after the high-dose measles vaccines, and that was later determined. Diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. So anybody want to say that in Danish? Okay. Everybody got it? Okay. And better yet, the measles disease does not relate to higher long-term mortality either. And here's the evidence. An article published in the journal Vaccine in 2002. Several studies show how much better children who had measles survived over the years following the infection compared to the uninfected controls. And here's one study that looked at it. And more closely, we can see that long-term mortality or death over a 4-year period in measles-exposed children after an epidemic. Based on blood testing that they did, children were categorized as either measles cases, subclinical, meaning they didn't have rash and everything, but the blood showed that they had infection, subclinical measles cases, or uninfected contacts because they had no rash and no rise in antibody titer. So measles survivors did better long-term than children who didn't get measles at all. And most of those measles cases who did better were not vaccinated. There were no deaths at all during this epidemic and this study in Africa. This graph shows you the higher survival probability for having measles or subclinical measles. As you can see on the top, these are the people that had measles or subclinical measles. Survival is plotted here, much higher survival over the following, I think it was 4 years, compared to those who had been exposed but had no or only slight immunity boost down here. These were labeled as the non-measles cases. And you can see that their survival was nowhere near as good over time. The difference between them was huge, and that's reflected in what we call the mortality ratio. If there's no effect, the mortality ratio would be 1.0. And if there was a beneficial effect to not having measles, the mortality ratio would be above 1. And if there's a benefit to having the disease, the mortality ratio would be below 1. And how far below 1 it is means how beneficial it was. 0.14, okay? That's a very low number that indicates a huge benefit of infection over the long term. So Dr. Peter Orby is the name, and I know I'm saying it wrong, but I used to say Orby, and that's probably even worse. So Dr. Peter Orby realized that not just measles vaccines, but measles infection, like measles vaccine, had a good effect on the immune system, and that surviving measles was not associated with a higher long-term death rate. So according to the Danish Dr. Orby, even in the poorest places, children who survived infection, which in this study was all of them, did not have a higher death rate from other diseases later. Dr. Mina, who did the study that I just told you about in 2015, says that high acute measles death in Africa makes Orby's data irrelevant. But there are two problems with that criticism. In some studies, Dr. Orby's death rates were either low or zero, and Dr. Orby says that even when there are acute deaths, meaning deaths right away when you get infected with measles, the benefit long-term over the period of years afterwards of how much survival there is compensates, well overcompensates for any acute deaths when those two groups are compared. He says, apparently, lower post-measles mortality compensates for acute measles mortality, and as a consequence, measles infection has a lower than expected overall impact on survival, meaning really on death. So in one respect, this is all irrelevant in developed countries like the United States and Denmark, because as Roman and I from Dissolving Illusions showed, the acute measles death rate was near zero before the vaccine came into use. So Mina's criticism is irrelevant. But even in impoverished African countries like Senegal, for instance, Dr. Orby found that there was no long-term mortality following measles disease there either. And their mortality rate was 0.27 in the infected index cases, meaning the ones that got it first and then spread it to others. He said the net impact of natural measles might be beneficial in situations with no acute mortality. And in another paper called Is Measles Good for Something?, Dr. Orby said, contrary to current assumptions, children who survive the acute phase of measles infection may have a survival advantage compared with unimmunized, uninfected children. Hence, both disease and immunization may be associated with nonspecific beneficial effects, presumably due to some form of immunostimulation. Denmark and other countries Mina studied would be the countries where survival of the acute infection was nearly universal. However, as you will see later, Mina and the co-author, Osterhaus, don't want parents to know inconvenient concepts like measles disease is really good for something. All these studies were deliberately ignored because the focus of Mina's report was to unveil to the public a new concept, that measles leaves you vulnerable to a host of deadly diseases. Perhaps the authors looked at each other and said, what the public doesn't know, that won't matter because no one will bother to read our references and any of Orby's other work. We know the media will print it, whatever we say. Note the author's name, Deborah Mackenzie, of this publicity article, because that's going to be important in a minute. But the focus of these publicity articles was not to doctors, because doctors just do as they're told. The focus was towards scaring the wits out of parents, and in particular, parents who didn't vaccinate their children. The problem was quickly identified, not measles, but the anti-vaccine movement. Immediately, they refuted the idea of measles being primarily a trivial illness. They used figures taken from some imaginary source, saying that brain damage in 2 or 3 out of every 1,000 cases, or death, even in wealthy countries. Now, anyone who studied the case numbers, the complications, and the deaths from measles in any single high-income country knows that the death rate they quoted here would only have been seen in the 1800s, or in the Great Depression, or during food deprivation, population dislocations such as war and things like that. I've studied measles cases and deaths in different countries of the world, both poor and wealthy. And it's very clear in both medical journals and documents written by governments, by health officials, that in the Western world, measles was far less severe by the 1930s and considered relatively trivial by 1960. The death decline graphs for many countries actually prove that. Parents clearly understand death decline the way we reported in Dissolving Illusions, using long-term data directly from reliable sources. Mina used Denmark as one of the 3 countries in the analysis. So let's look at your pre-vaccine mortality chart. Death is in black, and incidence or rates of measles disease are in red, and there's where your vaccine came in. Note that as the death rate is declining from measles, the incidence was rising after the 1940s. Dr. Mina ignores the low acute measles deaths because his hypothesis is that those red measles cases led to immune system ablation, or amnesia, and an increase in other deaths from other infectious diseases up to 3 years after the measles infection. So let's transfer those measles cases to the Danish death decline data for some of the diseases which Mina singled out. And thanks to some Danes, I was able to get this information, and Roman put these graphs together, showing you that pneumonia and other infectious disease deaths of children were landsliding, dropping rapidly at the same time that the measles attack rates were still sky high before the vaccines. The dotted line are measles attack rates or incidence, and this is the decline in pneumonia in 0 to 15-year-olds, and the blue line down here is in 0 to 14-year-olds, simply because the data was collected slightly differently in these 2 eras. And here in green, we have death from other infectious diseases below the age of 15. So other infectious disease deaths were also declining way before the vaccine. So where is the huge exponential decrease that Mina claimed to have occurred after the measles vaccine was introduced? Another co-author of this paper, named Brian Grenfell, stated in the Princeton University press release that at a population level, the data suggests that when measles was rampant, it may have led to a reduction in herd immunity against other infectious diseases. So how does that stack up with the Danish official data shown here? It's ludicrous, and it's totally unsubstantiated. Here is the Danish data analysis using all ages of children, which Mina specified in his article. And this one goes back to 1900, and we end in 2009. And we can see this is the measles attack rates in the red dotted line and the death rates in different age groups, 0 to 4 years. Sorry, this is total, this high line. And then we have 1 to 4 years old in the light blue, and then the older age groups are down here. So what's easy to see is a landslide fall in childhood infectious disease deaths, even when measles disease was rampant. In Dissolving Illusions, we give the history behind why this happened. And it had nothing to do with vaccines or antibiotics. There's no way to go back in time and try to single out one little subsegment of the childhood measles population back then, or even now, with mathematical modeling to look for a hidden pattern of death 2 to 3 years after children had measles. Mina is simply hunting for ghosts, and in order to scare everyone into vaccinating. One of the key points you need to remember is that the first time that Mina and his co-authors ran the data with their first set of assumptions, they didn't actually see what they wanted to see. They had to change both their assumptions and the way they analyzed the data. It was as if they said, oops, that didn't work, so let's change our endpoints and theories to create answers for the message that we want to send. And that's what they did, which gave them the result that they wanted. But the real question of credibility of this study, fortunately for those who aren't mathematicians, doesn't lie in the data manipulation at all. The big flaw in this study lies in the immunology assumptions, which was the second hypothesis. It stated that measles infection reduces the immune system memory to an empty shell, implying that all diseases for which one was vaccinated or had gained natural immunity to, once again, after the measles infection, became not just an individual threat that they could get infected again, but a community threat, as Dr. Grenfell alluded. So in order to sustain a hypothesis, you have to prove biological plausibility. Enter some monkeys and a researcher named De Vries, who hypothesized that while there must be immune memory erasure, they couldn't see it. Why? Because they thought that it was masked or covered up by an intense and specific immune response towards measles. In other words, they couldn't find the problem with the white blood cells that they were looking for, because when people were infected, their immune system was working very hard against measles, and so they couldn't see where it was suppressed or immune ablated elsewhere. So note the word suggest. This is not fact. And when we look at the monkey references, which I read thoroughly several times, we read that on one hand, they say the memory lymphocyte populations specific for previously encountered pathogens are not completely depleted and are largely restored during the weeks to months after measles. But then you go to the end and it says, we conclude that measles virus infection wipes immunological memory, resulting in increased susceptibility to commensal, meaning the ones that live in you normally, or opportunistic infections. So this paper contains two contradictory statements, one which says the memory cells are not completely depleted, and another which says immunological memory is wiped, meaning wiped means wiped, right? So how can those two statements exist in the same paper? I don't know. There was a second paper here, which is heavily referenced, and it's not even research. It was a summary paper full of beliefs, hypotheses, theories, and models, no data. So Dr. Mina and Dr. Osterhaus are thanked for their critical comments to the manuscript. Note that. Both articles were heavily referenced by Mina as evidence of long-term T and B cell immune suppression, even though Dr. Orby showed it doesn't happen in real-life humans, even in Africa. Mina and obviously De Vries are banking on doctors being too busy to go and read the references. Because doctors are too busy to check, nobody challenges anything. Most importantly, in the 2014 paper thanking Mina and Osterhaus for their comments, the concluding sentence says, "Clinical studies are required to test our hypothesis that measles immune suppression is mainly a numbers game." Yet not 5 months later, after no clinical studies at all had been done, Mina and Osterhaus, who were thanked in this paper, are presenting mathematical models that they say validate a non-clinical monkey hypothesis. Yet Dr. Orby made it very clear that there was no persistent T lymphocyte immune suppression in infected children 2 months after infection. By then, everything was back to normal. He says, in this 5-year follow-up study, he looked at vaccinated and unvaccinated, uninfected controls, and also vaccinated and unvaccinated infected cases, measles infected. And he says, contrary to the initial expectations, this is a guy that's willing to see something that's contrary to his initial expectations, measles cases who survived the acute phase had lower mortality than controls. By 2 months, everything was back to normal. And after 5 years, the children who had measles had better survival, which proved that there was no lethal suppression. And this is the kind of things that they looked at. Compared with controls, they looked at differences in white blood cell count, lymphocyte, CD4, all kinds of things. And they found that the post-measles cases had a mortality rate ratio of 0.5. Again, that means having measles was very beneficial over the long term. So Mina would say that these kids' T-cell counts, while normal, still had amnesia and couldn't protect them later from non-measles infections. But that can't be true because the survival rate was 2 times as high in the children who had measles compared to their more vaccinated, uninfected control counterparts. Vaccinated, uninfected controls also had more vaccines and a higher death rate. Here we have the cases, the ones who had measles, and you can see 38% of them were vaccinated. And this is their survival curve, much higher. And here are the ones that were 60% were vaccinated. They didn't get measles disease. And look at how much lower their survival curve was. So Dr. Orby's research actually contradicts Mina's hypothesis, commenting that 4 other studies in other countries also failed to find excess death rate, but instead found lower death rate in the post-measles period, which is the opposite of Mina's tenet, and why he's telling us that we all need to get measles vaccinated. The English have a term in science called the faggot fallacy, which is the fallacy of supposing that multiple pieces of evidence, each independently being weak or suspect, provide strong evidence when bundled together. Mina, knowing the power of numbers, adds the third twig to his 3-pronged faggot, which says that by removing pre-existing immunity, measles sets the child's body back to newborn status. And that's the cause of their death in the 3 years afterwards. How was this presented to non-vaccinating parents and the public? Co-author Osterhaus told the press that if their DTaP vaccinated child got measles, the measles infection would destroy immunity from the former vaccines that they had been given. A question: does that mean that any established vaccine or natural immunity to disease that was achieved before a measles vaccine came on the market was neutralized by any measles infection that came after? If that was true, then huge amounts of the pre-measles vaccine era children would have lost their vaccine and their natural immunity. And diphtheria and whooping cough and tetanus should have gone out of control. But that didn't happen, did it? What Mina and Osterhaus' hypothesis actually demonstrates is that Mina and Osterhaus' understanding of the newborn immune system and the development of neonatal immunity is flawed. Just listen to me instead of trying to take this in, because this is just proof of what I'm saying. It's not possible to set a child's immune system back to newborn status. I've done a long series on infant immunity that's on YouTube that goes into great detail on all of these studies that are here. If it was possible to set a child's immune system back to newborn status, it would have applied to every child born until a measles vaccine was introduced. And what they are saying now couldn't happen, didn't happen. But apart from the obvious proof that this is a fallacy, a newborn has an immune system which has fundamental differences to the immune system of an older child. And this is something that they're just beginning to understand in more detail. The latest medical literature on the subject, which I have listed up here, proves that the old thinking that babies are born defective is totally false. It's very helpful if you're trying to sell vaccines, though. Many old paradigms have recently been crushed by new knowledge available from modern testing and research. Everything now shows that newborns have a highly capable immune system, but it's clamped down while it's learning about tolerance to self and tolerance to the environment and all of the microbes that mother is passing to that baby. The anti-inflammatory status of newborns and young infants is controlled by breast milk, and it also is controlled by the placental transfusion and stem cells. It's a necessary part of well-rounded immune development and functions totally different to a child's immune system, whether that child has memory immunity or not. These three hypotheses are only believable because the work that was needed to clarify Dr. Orby's concerns was never done. These are the considerations that were overlooked due to lack of study. Measles infections having beneficial effects was proven by Dr. Orby. But he talks about the erroneous assumptions in the research and immunization policies. And he remarked that those erroneous assumptions were maintained because the research examining the total impact of vaccination was never done. He said somewhat sarcastically that those calling the shots didn't want reality to contradict their erroneous assumptions and ideas, and that just like so many falsehoods in medicine, they're just considered true and not in need of scientific verification. Dr. Orby was studying diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccines in Africa and noticing that children who had those vaccines had a higher death rate than children who didn't. And that's where part of his commentary is coming from. He wanted to do more research, and he was blocked from doing it by the World Health Organization. We continue to ask for more studies comparing vaccinated and non-vaccinated children and have yet to see them formally done because the science is settled and vaccines hit a home run. Yet still there are no long-term studies looking for the most important non-specific effects. While we are told over and over that we're working with proven fact, the research that upholds current policy talks much about assumptions and theories and models and surprises. We have not progressed since Dr. Orby said this in 1995. In fact, we have gone backwards because Mina took some of those erroneous assumptions and based his three hypotheses on them. And we are told that Mina's three hypotheses solved a 50-year-long mystery. We were getting on to the 50-year-old mystery that was cracked by Mina and co-authors about the measles vaccine. So to me, after reading this so many times and reading every single reference, the mystery is how they got away with the study design and the jury-rigged data and the flawed immunology to support their three hypotheses. Mina and his colleagues have supposedly been using computer models and medical records, as you can see here, to figure out what happened. But funny that there's no mention of medical records at all in that science paper or in the supplementary data, which I also have. And it would have been really great if real children's real clinical medical records from way back, or even from more recently, had formed any part of the confirmatory basis for their hypothesis. But that didn't happen. While the article admits that the conclusions are a hypothesis, the results were presented as a revolutionary, mathematically revealed discovery, which has solved some long-standing mystery upon which action should be taken. I read through these articles wondering why the world's expert on measles never noticed this phenomenon before, particularly if measles infection also wiped out any immunity gained from vaccines or from natural immunity before the vaccines were marketed. I couldn't understand why it was that the messages from lay media to parents and doctors didn't really discuss the study, but used the flawed conclusions as a direct attack against vaccine-hesitant parents. The answer became clear after looking closely at the track records of another author called Osterhaus. And his name on this paper is a big red flag. Osterhaus is a veterinarian who wears many hats, one of which is an organization called MUGAS, which was set up to fund a supposedly independent review of the anti-flu medication Tamiflu. So why are we talking about Tamiflu? Because Osterhaus, who is a veterinarian, has made his niche in animal flu and related infections. Because Osterhaus has been trying to frighten the public over impending animal flu into humans for years. He's currently known as Dr. Flu, or the swine flu Pope, in his home country, the Netherlands. His doctoral thesis was on peritonitis in cats. Now, I'm often criticized for being a nephrologist who criticizes vaccines. But this man is a veterinarian and doesn't even have a license to practice medicine on humans, yet he's in position to set world policy regarding vaccination to humans. He's also been criticized for what has been described as a fear campaign, calling for far-reaching measures to combat the 2009 flu pandemic. In an opinion piece, physician and microbiologist Miguel Eckelenkamp called Osterhaus a scaremonger. And he said, quote, "Expert Osterhaus should be banned indefinitely from television. Everything he claimed turned out to be untrue. We're not all going to die like we did in 1918. Not everyone needs a vaccination. We are not going to give Tamiflu to everyone, and the virus has not mutated into something much more dangerous." Osterhaus was also criticized in this Science Journal article by Martin Enserink in 2009. Now remember, this is the same journal that just printed this one that I'm putting around. The article here, looking more closely, quotes a Dr. Luc Bonneau calling Osterhaus a fearmongerer and also saying that an alpha male like Osterhaus is going to dominate all of the committees. Osterhaus was described as the alpha male. There was so much upheaval in the media over Osterhaus's behavior that health officials were concerned it would have an anti-vaccination effect on HPV vaccines. Note that this is the same journal that published Mina and Osterhaus that I just put around. So remember the name Martin Enserink, okay? Because that's going to become important also. Remember how Miguel Eckelenkamp mentioned Tamiflu. That's because Osterhaus also pushed Tamiflu, not just vaccines. And there's a reason for that. Dr. Tom Jefferson of the Cochrane Collaboration, who has come out against the influenza vaccine research and the comprehensive nature of it, he considered Tamiflu ineffective and published a statement saying that what was needed was total transparency with all of Roche, the manufacturer of Tamiflu's, data provided to the Cochrane Collaboration, which is an independent peer review collaborative effort. Roche took another route to keep its drug Tamiflu squeaky clean. And they partnered with Professor Ab Osterhaus, who formed MUGAS, and then reported that Cochrane declined their invitation to participate in the workshop. So Osterhaus found an innocuous-looking business partner, and Roche provided the money to set up MUGAS. But Osterhaus seems to never be short of an opinion or three, and he made it clear from the start that MUGAS's mission statement is to counter anti-vaccine lobbies, because according to MUGAS, which stands for Multi-Parity Group for Advice on Science, we always cause confusion. But you ask, what does MUGAS have to do with the media? Well, notice here, I'm just going to read this to you. He said, these are just clips that I took right off of the website. Whenever the public health debate suffers from a multitude of conflicting messages, studies, and conclusions, MUGAS Foundation can help by performing an independent overall review or analysis of all available scientific literature and data. And he says that anti-vaccination lobbies deliberately misconstrue information to suit their own needs. So as far as what they have to do with the media, Osterhaus is co-author with Mina, okay? And I looked carefully at MUGAS's partnerships. And this particular page hit me right between the eyes. MUGAS's multidisciplinary team. Remember Martin Enserink from Science? He's the European editor of the journal. He criticized Osterhaus in 2009, as you saw, and then he was brought into the team at MUGAS by 2013. We also have here Deborah McKenzie, you remember her, who broke the story in The New Scientist with a stinging rebuke to the anti-vaccine movement. Well, there are parts of MUGAS's members of the press, multidisciplinary team. Deborah McKenzie quoted her boss, Osterhaus, and pushed the aims of MUGAS in her writing. So it should be very clear and obvious now that this is a web of conflicted interests, all with the same aim: to beat up parents and health professionals who dare to question the huge money-making holy grail. Because, of course, we're all causing massive confusion. But it's hard to trust what we read, seeing that MUGAS is here primarily for the pharmaceutical companies, who can turn to MUGAS with any question that requires an independent review and analysis of existing research. Osterhaus has well-known and deep ties to the pharmaceutical industry and to the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization now receives more money from the pharmaceutical industry and private industry than it does from governments. Osterhaus is a man on a mission. And as far as his MUGAS is concerned, they have an obligation to join forces with journalists and anyone else who could be useful to determine public opinion. When only one side of the story is heard and often repeated, it will determine the public opinion. When that side of the story appears to be wrong, the scientific community has the moral obligation to join forces and to counter misleading messages with better data and stronger analyses. They're here to settle the scientific debate. Here is MUGAS's media partner, Deborah McKenzie again, reporting about Mina's article in The New Scientist. The voice behind her is obviously Osterhaus, who again identifies his target, the anti-vaccination movement, right here. You saw another Osterhaus comment directed at the anti-vaccine in a previous slide. The message to the public wasn't just about a newly discovered terrible effect of measles. It was about hitting up Osterhaus's favorite target, the non-vaccinating parents. Even in the medical article published in Science, the article starts and finished, as you can see in the article I put around, with non-vaccinators in mind. The last sentence is really interesting, and I've clipped out the beginning and the end of that article. And it reads, quote, "Our findings help dispel the mystery surrounding the disproportionately large reductions in mortality seen after the introduction of the measles vaccination." This is just a mathematically synthesized construct. It's opinion. It's not fact. There was no disproportionate decrease in mortality after the introduction of measles vaccines to high-income countries. not from measles and not from any other type of infection. And proof of that is found in core infectious disease textbooks used by medical schools, such as this one by Nelson, 2005. See the bottom line here? That is infectious disease deaths. Look at it after 1950. And you can see that there is almost no progress of decline in infectious disease deaths. Here's where the vaccine for measles in America came in. Now compare that to the disproportionate fall in deaths that happened beforehand. That first measles vaccine was used in America in 1963. Look how all deaths decreased independently of antibiotics or vaccines. Influenza and pneumonia in 1900, 202 per 100,000 died. By 1935, there was no influenza vaccine. We're down by half. By 1970, when there was a very poor vaccine only given to a small amount of the population, we're down further. Tuberculosis, almost gone by 1970. We never used BCG vaccine in America. Gastroenteritis, almost gone by 1970. There's no gastroenteritis vaccine. Now today there's rotavirus, but there wasn't then. Typhoid fever, it's gone. There was no typhoid fever vaccine in America. Measles, 13.3 mortality rate per 100,000, which is very low compared to these other diseases. By 1935, we're down to 3.1. By 1970, we're down to 0. Dysentery, whooping cough, scarlet fever, meningitis, it's all the same. The trends were clearly going down before the vaccines. So I wonder why so many people are unaware of tables like this from medical textbooks that show the decline in death before the wide use of vaccines. Why are parents expected to believe that Mina's findings dispel a mystery which doesn't even exist? This kind of information is what is written in Dissolving Illusions, is not considered essential concepts by people whose writing excludes honesty, because policy is always more important. Everything I talk about today are the concepts that you're not supposed to know. When Osterhaus talks about determining public opinion, he's really talking about removing from your knowledge everything the medical system considers to be non-essential concepts. This is nothing new, as you can see from this pediatrics article from 1996, where so-called parent comprehension is discussed, but where parental behavior objectives and the desired health behavior are the real endpoints. And I'm just going to read this important part to you. Current materials contain an excessive amount of information that most patients do not find useful. The number of concepts per pamphlet should be limited. Pamphlet authors should determine the key points that the patient or parent needs to know to achieve the behavioral objective. Not in order to be healthy or to have a full understanding, but to achieve the behavioral objective. Non-essential concepts can then be deleted. The key is to write for the desired health behavior rather than for high-level knowledge. All right? That's what they think of you. But for you, the concepts I'm talking about today are the ones that put everything into its correct perspective. Osterhaus is trying to get parents to conform. One of the reasons this talk is called manufactured consent is the information they give you is manufactured, carefully crafted, and put together to create a picture in your mind to make you scared. That's done by leaving out the high-level knowledge, which would counterbalance their fear-mongering. What they consider non-essential concepts are the ones that change the whole equation in favor of not vaccinating. By taking out that high-level knowledge, or what they consider non-essential concepts, they get you to do what they want you to do. And this is what Mugas, Osterhaus, and Mina are trying to do. They are rewriting history to change your perception, to alter your emotions. That could lead you to vaccinate out of fear. Popular press is altering peer pressure so that vaccinating parents will verbally abuse and ostracize non-vaccinators. It's medieval behavior, and it's ramped up through the internet. In an attempt to get to the bottom of the math, I started discussing this paper with both pro-vaccine people and people on the fence. And there were some lively discussions, and one of them was particularly fruitful. In an email to a friend of mine, Mina said this: while mortality was very high at the earlier years in our study, for example, about 13 in 100,000, it dropped to about 4 per 100,000 after vaccination. So this simply put words to what we already see in the study. And the graph might look like a landslide if you just look at this here, but the difference between those two red lines is only 9 per 100,000. And Mina admitted to hunting for a needle in a haystack. But the problem I have is that the needle actually doesn't exist. He goes on to say, now, while this is a 70% reduction in mortality, from an absolute numbers point of view, it's only 9 per 100,000. In my opinion, it's not difficult to consider that for every 16,000 individuals with possible immune amnesia, a small fraction may have been at the extreme side of things, resulting in an average 9 deaths as a consequence. Measles was much more common than overall deaths, and thus it would be the rare individual who A, died, only 4 to 14 per 100,000, and B, had that death subsequently linked to a measles infection 2 years prior. This is all assumption from a study that didn't originally get the results they wanted from their data, so they changed the assumptions to get their new theory. To attribute 9 deaths to post-measles immune suppression is like stretching a rubber band to infinity. And even if a doctor had, say, 30,000 children in their medical practice, they may never have seen a patient that died from theoretical post-measles immune suppression. Looked at from the real-world perspective and undoctored data, there was never an existing mystery to solve. But even more interesting is the Danish data section of Mina's study that I passed around. Look at what he says was a problem. He said, quote, because measles vaccine introduction in Denmark in 1987 occurred as data became available, we were compelled to focus on the 2 decades that followed the logarithmic reduction of cases, 1990 to 2010. What Mina is saying is that because of the lack of measles incidence data before the vaccine was introduced, they had to analyze the data in the 20 years after vaccination in order to determine what happened in the 20 years before vaccination. Thank you. He put a link in the paper to the Danish data, which started from 1981. But if he had bothered to look on the same website where he got his limited data, he would have found this graph, which would have told him that Denmark's measles case data goes back actually to 1862, and that his data was incomplete, so he should have requested more. My friend sent Mina the earlier data and this graph, and he asked why he didn't include it in his analysis, and then Mina went silent and didn't return any of his emails. There actually were no data limitations. He could have had all the data he wanted. He could have also done what Roman and I did with the help of some Danish people here, which was a quick PubMed search, which came up with Melker in 2001, which had this graph on the right. Now, if you look at that red square, that's where I have superimposed onto Melker's graph Mina's limited data from Denmark part, which you can also see, this is from Mina's paper on the left. So for the purpose of Mina's hypothesis, it might have been better for him to have data limitations to generate the results that he was seeking. If Mina had gone from 1976, like Melker did here, he could have had all this data, or better yet, if he used the data from 1957, like we did, to make our new graphs, might his calculations have panned out differently? Here it is again, our new graphs that Roman put together from the data that our friends here got. On non-measles deaths in children from Denmark plotted against the measles incidence. Mina could have done his fancy gamma magic on this data, But he chose not to. He started where the arrow is instead. The data was all there. Mina cherry-picked Denmark's data to manufacture the emperor's new clothes, which was the so-called 50-year-old mystery of the 3-year deadly measles shadow. So there's a far bigger problem than 9 out of 100,000 theoretical deaths from measles immune suppression. The non-specific effects of killed vaccines, now remember measles and smallpox and BCG, they're live vaccines, and they stimulate the immune system in a very different way than the killed vaccines do. And I did a very long and detailed talk on this in Oslo, Norway this year, and it will be available to you soon if you want to know more about that. But the non-specific effects of killed vaccines is a very big problem because A, they have aluminium, and B, because they stimulate the immune system in a very different way towards what we call Th2. So less towards cell-mediated immunity, which is really important if you want to fight off viruses and bacteria, and more towards the antibody and B cell arm of immunity. That's what happens with the killed vaccines. But you're not going to hear very much about this from doctors and health officials. Live vaccines affect the immune systems radically different. The difference, the live vaccines affect Th1, which is the T cells, cell-mediated immunity. Okay, I was trying to tell you what, I don't know. It might be that, see, when I do this talk in Norway, I give a little mini immunology talk, which helps, but I don't have time to do that today. But just, if you would just trust me for now, because it's well established in the medical literature that the live vaccines like measles actually do have a beneficial effect on the immune system. It's the same as if you get the measles disease, in a sense, because live vaccines actually are a little case of the disease. Okay, it's not like a magic. It's basically they inject you with the disease so that you can gain immunity to it. And it's not as strong as an immunity as you would from the actual disease. But so they have a beneficial effect on the immune system. Killed vaccines don't. They don't have a beneficial effect. There's nothing good they do to the immune system directly. So scientists who have uncovered this phenomenon and tried to have something done about it have been categorically ignored by the World Health Organization. There's an ongoing problem that's detailed in piles of medical articles, which show negative effects after killed vaccines in both low and high-income countries. You live in a high-income country, obviously. But anyone who goes under the spell of today's medico-political hypnosis will just believe the spin from Princeton University News, which says that the measles disease deadly shadow weakens the immune system for up to 3 years, leaving people vulnerable to other diseases, which they already had immunity to. But Mina and Osterhaus come to the rescue, and they say, it's okay, just go and get your MMR jab, because the vaccine completely stops the 3-year immune ablation shadow. Those who believe such nonsense have not read the rest of Dr. Orby's work, which shows that measles disease was not the problem regarding long-term death. The problem was DPT and killed vaccines and the sequence in which those vaccines were given. And he discovered that in Africa. Dr. Orby talks about this problem more than any other scientist. More recent work has shown that it's not just DTP, which was the old vaccine, but it's the new one, DTAP, that also does this. All killed vaccines can set the immune system at a disadvantage to fighting other diseases in the long term. Okay? Many studies show the marked negative effects of DTP alone or with a live vaccine. I'm just listing 4 of them here. This one here talks about the 2-fold increase in death in the only community study of the introduction of DTP, What they did is they looked in Africa at this population of the baseline death rate, and then after they introduced the vaccine, how it changed, and the death rate doubled. There was a threefold lower rate in hospital case death when DTP was missing from the vaccine schedule in these other countries. There was a fourfold increase in death when DTP was given after the live vaccine BCG in a trial of early BCG vaccination. There was a twofold increase in death when DTP was given after that high titer measles vaccine. And that's what I talked about earlier, where they got that misconception that it was all about measles. It wasn't. It was this, when DTP was administered after that high concentration measles vaccine. This African study went one step further and showed that giving a live and killed vaccines together was far worse than giving live vaccines only. The death rates 6 to 12 months later was appallingly high for the killed plus vaccines. Here we have killed plus live, hepatitis B, Hib, DTaP plus the live, measles and yellow fever. And look here at the death rate. Here we have just the live vaccines, measles and yellow fever, and look at the death rate long term. It's ridiculous. And the authors were not happy. And they noted that putting live and inactivated or killed vaccines together increased the death rate somewhere between 6 and 329% compared to just live vaccines. The African schedules are now starting to follow the lines of the schedules in Western countries. So it's logical to ask what happens in Western countries. Up until 5 years ago, Western vaccine studies never looked at what Orby was looking at in Africa. And because Orby is based in Scandinavia, your countries are now at the forefront of that research. Results so far show that inactivated vaccines used in Europe negatively affect immune systems, raising hospital admissions. The first study I want to discuss is a 2015 Denmark study, which looked at whether or not DTaP, IPV is polio, Hib, Haemophilus influenza B, it's a 5-in-1 vaccine, whether that injection might increase hospital admissions for a particular type of respiratory virus called respiratory syncytial virus, RSV. So they have 168,511 children. And they gave this killed vaccines at the regular scheduled time here, which is 3, 5, and 12 months of age. And then they gave MMR at 15 months. And they don't use any unvaccinated controls. Can't do that. But the question was, does the type of last vaccine injected affect RSV hospital admission in Denmark? And the answer is yes, it does. Having MMR as the most recent, so what they did is they saw who showed up with RSV and what their last vaccine was, okay? So having MMR as the most recent vaccine was associated with a lower rate of RSV hospital admissions, but having the inactivated DTaP, IPV, HIB as the most recent vaccine resulted in increased hospital admission. The incidence rate ratio was 0.75, meaning that MMR lowered the admission rate below 1 down to 0.75, showing that MMR had a favorable effect. On the basis of this finding, parents here can logically and correctly state that these killed vaccines put their child at increased risk of other infections during the period that their immune system is under that vaccine's program. Once again, there were no unvaccinated controls, and there should have been some information on them if they're getting infected too. We're left guessing why they are not there. The proposed solution in this paper to the killed vaccine problem is to give more live vaccines and to consider giving them at a younger age. Why might earlier administration of MMR be more beneficial? Because they know that the inactivated vaccines result in higher hospitalizations during the time that they're affecting the immune system. And it should be obvious to anyone that killed vaccines are a problem. And to study this properly, we need to study vaccinated versus never vaccinated children, not just differently vaccinated children. But there's a reason that we can't study those never vaccinated children, and there's a reason that Orby couldn't when he was in Africa. And he states the problems quite clearly in his writings. I'm just going to let you read, unless you want me to read it to you. Do you want me to read that to you? All right. It is considered unethical to conduct randomized trials with already recommended vaccines to measure their overall effect on morbidity and mortality, even though these effects were never measured. Two vaccines may have completely different effects when administered together. Although tens of thousands of studies assessing disease-specific, meaning measles for measles vaccine, antibody-inducing effects of vaccines have been conducted, most people have not examined whether vaccines have non-specific effects, because current perception excludes such effects. As you can see, Dr. Orby clearly stated the case that current perception excludes such effects. But he's actually kind of wrong. He really should have said current perception precludes such studies, because they know clearly that there's a problem there, and they refuse to study it using non-vaccinated children. All they want to do is fix the problem using more vaccines in a different order, given earlier, and hope you don't notice what the real problem is. Here's another study that you need to know about, which is, in effect, another non-specific effects trial. This time, there were 495,987 Danish children born between 1997 and 2006, and they followed them for 2 years. And they compared the difference, either MMR or the killed vaccines, as the last vaccine. And the results showed that if the MMR was the last vaccine, that the incidence of hospitalization was reduced with an incidence rate ratio of 0.86. But if the last vaccine was inactivated, giving that Th2 bias, hospitalization increased with IRR of 1.62. Hello, that's really high. And this is very similar to what Dr. Orby saw in Africa. Again, there's no mention of unvaccinated baby admissions. Why not? Are there none, or are they just ignored? Their stated conclusion was the inactivated vaccines are driving an increase in illness, just the same as in Africa. They confirmed this by saying that vaccines do have non-specific effects even in high-income countries. And while they don't know all the non-specific effects, they're pretty sure that it involves something called epigenetic modulation, meaning that the genes are affected in how they open and close and which ones are functioning. And it's all very well to study epigenetic modulation, but what would the normal baseline be? The only normal child in the room is the breastfed, non-vaccinated child, which the designers of these studies seem obstinately unwilling to identify and to include, which makes those children the elephant in the room. But in my experience, they're the healthiest elephants. They should be calculated into any equation that looks at long-term effects, especially when looking backwards retrospectively, because it can be done so easily. And the fact that killed vaccines have negative health effects and make children more susceptible to other infections needs to be seen for the big issue that it is, which is far bigger than any theoretical sliver of the population that Mina and Osterhaus think might have died from non-existent long-term immunomodulation. I predict that instead of considering the facts that I've put here, that critics will point to my comments on the associations between the authors, the media, and the manipulation of public opinion. And they will certainly try to slander my character or say that I'm creating a conspiracy where there is none. I've documented the published science and what I believe are the key roles of the key players. And I leave it to you to look at the facts and my references and make up your own mind. What I see is that Mina found this little sliver of a tiny theoretical number of people who might have had a problem, which he admits is so insignificant that most doctors wouldn't have ever seen it. He talked about a reduction from 13 per 100,000 down to 4 per 100,000, which equals 9 theoretical people out of 100,000 based on flawed immunological hypotheses, incomplete data, and questionable mathematical methods. The views of an American medical student and a Dutch veterinarian who is named Dr. Flu by his own countrymen are lauded as immutable truth. When I, as a nephrologist, pointed out the blindingly obvious problems with my patients who became gravely ill after they were vaccinated, I was totally ignored or told there was no relationship, and to conduct my own research if I wanted to prove it. Suddenly, I was responsible for exonerating the pharmaceutical company's products. In the last 4 years, I have come across so many parents who report that their babies died shortly after vaccination, that I know the death rate is more than 9 per 100,000. The question is, who has their heads in the sand? What would those with their heads in the sand do if they realized that they had collectively spent decades explaining away parents' reality with a legion of excuses on top of ridicule, which actually kept them blind to the carnage that vaccines were creating all around them? Nothing. Because if the pro-vaccine key opinion people were ever to admit that any of what I've said is true, parents would demand justice. The current status quo is all about survival of reputations, peer acclaim, and the golden egg-laying geese. And the facts show it. And that is the last slide with an aurora